Oak Alley, Louisiana. 28 live oaks, planted in two perfect rows, their branches locked overhead into a tunnel of green, a quarter-mile long. At the far end, white columns. A house so symmetrical it looks designed by mathematics. Every photograph ever taken of it pulls the eye forward, toward the columns, toward the light, toward something that feels, in the frame at least, like permanence. This image exists in 1,000 variations across the Deep South, and it has done more to shape how Americans understand plantation houses than any historian, any museum, any documentary ever made. It is also, in almost every important way, a lie of omission. The antebellum plantation house is a specific building type, born in a specific moment for specific reasons. The word antebellum simply means before the war, before the Civil War, in the 3 decades roughly between 1830 and 1860. These were the years when cotton and sugar profits flooded the Deep South, when land speculation pushed plantation agriculture westward into Mississippi and Louisiana, and when a particular class of wealthy white planters decided that the way to announce their arrival was to build in the image of ancient Greece. Greek Revival architecture had been sweeping the young United States since the early 1800s. There was something irresistible about the imagery: columns, pediments, symmetry, the suggestion of democracy and civilization borrowed from the classical world. In the North, it appeared on courthouses and banks. In the Deep South, planters took it and scaled it up. Full-height Doric or Corinthian columns became the defining feature of the type. Raised foundations lifted the house above flood-prone ground and caught the breeze. Wide wraparound galleries provided shade in a climate brutal 9 months of the year. The houses faced the river, the Mississippi, the James, the Savannah, because rivers were the highways of the cotton economy and your house needed to be seen from the water. The result was an architecture that looked eternal. That was precisely the point. But before going further into what these houses are, it is worth being clear about what they are not, because the mythology around them has been as carefully constructed as the buildings themselves. The plantation big house of popular imagination, the one from tourism brochures, from the long shadow of Gone with the Wind, from 100 wedding venue websites, suggests this was simply how the South lived. Grand, gracious, a certain leisured elegance spread across the landscape like Spanish moss. The reality is narrower. Even at the peak of the plantation era, only a small fraction of white Southerners owned plantations of any significant size, and only a fraction of those lived in houses that looked anything, like Oak Alley or Nottoway. Most slaveholders, and most white Southerners altogether, lived in ordinary farmhouses. Not mansions. The houses that survived, the ones that became tourist sites and film sets and architectural landmarks, represent the extreme upper end of the wealth distribution. They survived partly because they were built well, and partly because money tends to preserve the things it created. The modest, the ordinary, the unremarkable. Those structures decayed, were torn down, quietly disappeared. What remains is a curated sample, and that sample has been doing a great deal of cultural work ever since. Geographically, the type clusters in a specific arc of the South. Louisiana's River Road between New Orleans and Baton Rouge is where the type survives in its most concentrated form. Oak Alley, Laura, Nottoway, one after another along the river's curve. Mississippi built them wider, heavier, as if the delta itself demanded more weight. South Carolina's Rice Coast angled its galleries to catch the sea breeze, the piazzas running the length of the house like an open lung. Virginia's Tidewater went further back still, older bones, Georgian in memory, Greek Revival only in the newer additions bolted on when the style swept south in their bones. What unites them across those regional differences is not just style but function. These were not simply houses. They were the administrative and symbolic centers of large agricultural enterprises, closer in organizational terms to a factory headquarters than to a family home. The big house sat at the apex of a landscape that included slave quarters, overseers' houses, barns, smokehouses, cotton gins or sugar mills, and work yards extending in every direction. The columns and the allée were the public face. Everything that actually made the operation run was pushed behind it to the edges of the frame. This is what the famous photograph never shows. Stand at the end of Oak Alley's tunnel of oaks, and the geometry is genuine, the trees are real, the house is beautiful in a way that is genuinely difficult to argue with. But the photograph has a frame. And outside that frame, behind the house, beyond the formal garden, there was once a different landscape entirely. Rows of small wooden cabins, work yards, a sugar operation, a world of enforced labor running from before dawn to well after dark, producing the profits that paid for every column, every imported mahogany door, every chandelier shipped upriver from New Orleans. The architecture was designed to manage exactly that relationship, to keep labor invisible from the front approach, to ensure a guest arriving by riverboat saw columns and live oaks, not the system underneath them. Understanding these houses means holding both things in view at once. The beauty is real. The question is what it was built to conceal, and how deliberately. That is where this story starts. By the 1830s, cotton prices on the Atlantic market were setting the rhythm of an entire civilization. That rhythm determined whether a Louisiana planter ordered marble mantelpieces from Italy or made do with painted wood. It determined whether a Mississippi landowner expanded his acreage westward or held still. It determined ultimately whether another column went up on another house along the river road, or whether the foundation sat unfinished through another season, waiting for prices to recover. The Antebellum plantation house was not built on southern soil alone. It was built on a transatlantic commodity market, a web of credit stretched between New Orleans counting houses and London banks, and a system of forced labor so economically efficient that it reshaped the entire American interior in less than 30 years. To understand where these houses came from, you have to follow the money, all the way back to its source. Cotton was the engine. By the 1830s, the American South was producing more than half the world's cotton supply, and the majority of it flowed through New Orleans, the second busiest port in the United States, before crossing the Atlantic to feed the textile mills of Lancashire and Manchester. The profits were real, and for a specific class of large planters, they were extraordinary. A plantation running a large enslaved workforce on prime Mississippi Delta land in a good year could generate returns that rivaled the most successful industrial enterprises in the North. Sugar told a parallel story in Louisiana. Sugarcane cultivation was concentrated in the parishes along the lower Mississippi, and it produced some of the wealthiest planters in the antebellum South. Sugar was more capital-intensive than cotton. The processing equipment alone, the mills and kettles and clarifiers, represented enormous fixed costs, but the margins for those who could sustain the investment were equally enormous. The grandest houses on the river road were almost all sugar money. Nottoway, the largest surviving antebellum mansion in the South at 53,000 square feet, was built by John Hampton Randolph on the back of a sugar operation running 155 enslaved workers. The scale of the house and the scale of the labor force were not coincidental. They were the same equation, expressed two different ways. But here is the part the architecture does not advertise. Almost none of this was built with cash. The antebellum plantation economy ran on credit, and that credit was secured in large part by the bodies of enslaved people. Banks across the South routinely accepted enslaved men, Women and children as collateral for mortgages and agricultural loans. A planter who wanted to build a new house, expand his acreage, or purchase additional enslaved workers would borrow against the people he already owned. The enslaved were simultaneously the labor force that generated the income and the collateral that secured the debt. By the 1850s, nearly every ounce of credit in the South touched the cotton economy, and human property was the largest line item on a planter's balance sheet. This was not backroom dealing. It was banking. The same ledger entries, the same legal instruments, the same collateral appraisals, flowing through Southern counting houses and Northern banks alike, tying the bodies of enslaved people to financial networks that stretched from New Orleans to London and back. The columns and the credit were inseparable. What did it actually cost to build one of these houses? Precise figures vary and records are incomplete, but the surviving data gives a sense of the scale. A substantial Greek Revival plantation house in the 1840s or 1850s might cost anywhere from $10,000 to $40,000 to construct, at a time when a skilled urban craftsman earned perhaps $1 a day. The structure itself, however, was often the smaller part of the expense. Furnishing and finishing a house at the level expected of a planter of consequence was where costs escalated dramatically. Nottoway took 2 years and over 1 million bricks, every one of them laid by the same 155 enslaved workers who would never sleep inside it. The marble arrived from Italy, the glass from Venice, the carpets by the room, the hardware by the crate. The house was assembled from 4 continents. The labor came from 1. The material contents of a finished plantation house were a catalog of the Atlantic trade. Economy, assembled in a Louisiana parlor and paid for on credit that itself rested on the enforced productivity of the people living in the cabins behind the house. The credit system that built these houses was also the system that made them vulnerable. When cotton prices collapsed in the late 1830s, dozens of planters fell into insolvency almost overnight. Construction projects across Mississippi and Louisiana froze mid-frame. Houses sat half-built for years. Some planters lost everything: land, house, and the people they had mortgaged, in the space of a single season. Those who survived rebuilt carefully. By the 1840s and into the boom years of the 1850s, construction resumed with even greater ambition. The houses that went up in that final decade before the Civil War were in many cases the most elaborate of the entire antebellum period, as though the planters who built them understood at some level that the window was closing and the statement needed to be definitive. There is a particular detail worth holding on to. When a planter borrowed money to build his house using enslaved people as collateral, those people had no knowledge of the transaction, no legal standing within it, and no share of whatever the house eventually represented. They were the foundation, financially, structurally, in almost every sense, of an edifice built to celebrate a life entirely removed from their own. The columns went up, the allée was planted, the parlor was furnished with imported silk, and the ledger, somewhere in a New Orleans counting house, listed names and ages and estimated values in the same column as timber costs and bricklayer wages. That is the balance sheet behind the beauty. Walk through the front door of a great antebellum plantation house, and the first thing that hits you is the air. Even on a Louisiana. Afternoon in August, the kind of heat that sits on your chest like wet wool, the interior of a well-built plantation house is measurably cooler than the world outside. The ceilings soar 12, sometimes 15 feet overhead. The windows run nearly floor to ceiling on both sides of the central hall. A cross breeze moves through the length of the house with a steadiness that feels almost engineered. It is engineered. Almost every feature of the antebellum plantation house that reads today as aesthetic choice, the high ceilings, the deep galleries, the tall windows, the raised foundation, was first and foremost a climate solution. Before mechanical cooling, before electric fans, before any of the infrastructure modern buildings take for granted, these houses were sophisticated passive ventilation machines. The beauty and the engineering were the same thing, expressed in plaster and wood and brick. But the architecture was solving more than one problem at once, and the second problem it was solving had nothing to do with heat. The organizing principle of the antebellum plantation house interior is the central hall plan. A wide corridor, sometimes 10 or 12 feet across, runs straight through the house from the front door to the rear, dividing the ground floor into two symmetrical halves. Rooms open off either side, double parlors to one side, a formal dining room to the other, a library or study tucked toward the rear. The staircase rises from this hall, usually in a generous curve designed to be seen and admired by anyone entering from the front. This layout served ventilation first. Opening both the front and rear doors created a through draft that drew hot air out of the house. But it also served something else. It controlled movement. The central hall was the spine of the house's social geography. A visitor entering through the front door was immediately oriented. The formal rooms were to the left and right, accessible and visible. Everything beyond, the rear of the house, the service spaces, the working parts of the operation, was behind closed doors, down back stairs, or removed to separate outbuildings entirely. The house was designed so that the experience of being a guest in it required encountering almost none of the labor that sustained it. The formal rooms on the ground floor were the public face of plantation life. Double parlors, two interconnected reception rooms that could be opened into a single large entertaining space by folding back the doors between them, were standard in houses of any pretension. These rooms received visitors, hosted business discussions, displayed the family's taste and wealth through furniture, portraits, imported carpets, and decorative objects. The dining room, usually positioned for convenient access from the kitchen, was where the planter performed hospitality, a political act as much as a social one, since feeding neighbors, business partners, and local officials well was a form of maintaining influence. High ceilings in these rooms were not merely comfortable. They were communicative. A ceiling of 12 to 15 feet said something specific about the man who built the house. It said he had the resources to heat that volume of air in winter, to light it adequately, to furnish it at a scale that didn't look ridiculous. It said, in the architectural language of the era, that he belonged to a particular class and intended to be taken seriously within it. Now consider how food arrived at that dining room table. In most antebellum plantation houses, the kitchen was not inside the main structure at all. It was a separate outbuilding positioned to the rear, sometimes connected by a covered walkway, sometimes entirely detached. This was partly a fire precaution. A kitchen fire in a detached structure was a serious problem, but a kitchen fire inside the main house was a catastrophe. But the separation served another purpose. It kept the sounds, smells, heat, and above all the people of food preparation invisible to anyone in the formal rooms. Food traveled from a detached kitchen across an open yard or covered passage, carried by enslaved domestic workers who moved through a rear service landscape specifically designed to keep them out of the sightlines of formal entertaining. Backstairs, narrower, steeper, tucked against the rear wall, connected the service basement to the upper floors. Service entrances opened onto rear yards rather than front approaches. The house was a machine for producing a single illusion, that everything arrived, the food, the pressed linen, the polished silver, the warm room, somehow without human effort. The raised basement or raised foundation, common in Louisiana and coastal South Carolina particularly, added another layer to this system. Ground floors were elevated 4, 6, sometimes 8 feet above grade on brick piers or a continuous masonry base. This protected against flooding, improved airflow beneath the structure, and created a semi-enclosed basement level that could house storage, wine cellars, and in many cases the working infrastructure of the house: laundry, food storage, sometimes the quarters of domestic workers who needed to be on call through the night. The basement was below the sight line of anyone approaching from the front. Whatever happened there, the washing, the pressing, the storing, the sleeping, was architecturally submerged. Upstairs, the bedroom floors followed similar logic. Family bedrooms occupied the primary rooms. Smaller rooms at the rear, adjacent to the back stairs, were used by children's nurses and personal attendants who needed to be close but not visible. Privacy in the antebellum plantation house was not a concept that applied equally to everyone inside it. For the family, the architecture provided seclusion and comfort. For the domestic workers who maintained that comfort around the clock, the architecture provided proximity without acknowledgement. This is what makes these buildings remarkable as objects of study. Beyond their undeniable visual power, every spatial decision, where the stairs are, where the kitchen sits, where the service entrance opens, is a decision about who gets to be seen and who is supposed to disappear. The house was built to project order, grace, and effortless refinement. The effort was never effortless. It was simply designed out of view. Somewhere in the archives of the Historic New Orleans collection, there is a plantation account book from the 1840s. Time equals 1.0 seconds / greater than, it records, in careful columns, the daily expenses of running a Louisiana sugar operation: lumber deliveries, brick costs, payments to a plasterer, payments to a carpenter. And then, in the same ledger, in the same handwriting, the names of enslaved people, their ages, their assigned tasks, their estimated monetary value as property. The plasterer who received payment and the enslaved bricklayer who worked beside him are recorded in the same document, one as a creditor, one as an asset. The house they built together still stands, only one of them is remembered as having built it. This is the central fact of antebellum plantation construction. The most skilled, most sustained, and most consequential labor that went into these buildings was performed by people who received nothing for it, were credited with nothing for it, and whose names were recorded, when recorded at all, in the same columns as livestock and farm equipment. The construction of a significant plantation house was not a quick affair. A house of the scale of Oak Alley or Nottoway could take 3 to 5 years from groundbreaking to finished interior, sometimes longer if credit tightened or materials were delayed. The workforce involved was large, layered, and surprisingly specialized. At the top were white master builders or architects, often brought in from New Orleans, Natchez, or Charleston, who provided the design and supervised the overall project. Below them was a workforce composed largely of enslaved craftsmen, men trained or self-trained in specific building trades who did the physical construction from foundation to roofline. Enslaved carpenters framed the structures. Enslaved bricklayers laid the foundations and the chimneys. Enslaved plasterers finished the interior walls and applied the elaborate decorative moldings, the cornices, the ceiling medallions, the column. Capitals that give these houses their visual richness. Enslaved blacksmiths produced the ironwork, hinges, railings, the decorative cast iron galleries so characteristic of New Orleans and its surrounding parishes. In some cases, enslaved workers were hired out by their enslavers to plantation construction projects, their wages collected not by them, but by the person who legally owned them. The skill involved in this work was genuine and substantial. Plastering alone, particularly the ornamental plasterwork in formal rooms, required years of training and a high degree of craft precision. The men who executed these details were not unskilled laborers. They were artisans, operating at a level of technical competence that their enslavers recognized, documented, and profited from, while simultaneously denying them any of the social recognition that skill was supposed to confer in that era. Materials told their own. story about the reach of the plantation economy. Brick for foundations and chimneys was often produced locally. Some large plantations ran their own brick-making operations, using enslaved labor to dig clay, form and fire bricks in kilns on the property. This was grueling, seasonal work, producing the raw material of the house's permanent structure from the same land and the same workforce that grew the cotton or cut the cane. Lumber came from regional sawmills, themselves often dependent on enslaved labor. Cypress, abundant in Louisiana's swamps, was prized for its rot resistance and was harvested and milled by enslaved workers before being shaped by enslaved carpenters into the framing, flooring, and millwork of the finished house. The finishing materials were a different matter. Italy for the marble, the Caribbean for the mahogany, Philadelphia for the ironwork, France for the wallpaper. Every surface in the finished house was a receipt, a record of money spent, of ships crossed, of credit extended and interest accruing. The interior of a finished plantation house was, in its material composition, a map of the Atlantic world, every expensive surface a product of long-distance trade assembled in a Louisiana or Mississippi parlor to project the impression of a civilization that had arrived, fully formed, from somewhere ancient and authoritative. Inside the finished house, a different workforce took over. The domestic labor force of a large plantation house was substantial and highly organized. At Nottoway's scale, dozens of enslaved domestic workers kept the house running: butler, cook, ladies' maids, coachmen, laundresses, seamstresses, nurses. Think about what that means in practice. Someone rose before the family to lay the fires. Someone carried the water. Someone pressed the dress, polished the silver, kept the candles, trimmed. The house that looked effortless required a small workforce operating around the clock, invisible by design. This workforce was overwhelmingly female, with the exception of the butler and coachman roles. The women who cooked, cleaned, laundered, and cared for the planter family's children worked days that began before the family rose and ended well after the family retired. They lived in the house, in the basement, in small rear rooms adjacent to the back stairs, or in quarters immediately behind the main structure. Close enough to be summoned at any hour, removed enough to remain out of sight during formal entertaining. Behind the big house, extending into the working landscape that formal photographs never captured, were the quarters. Small wooden cabins, usually arranged in rows along a street or lane set back from the main house, housing the field workers and many of the domestic workers' families. These structures were built quickly and cheaply from the same lumber and the same labor pool as the main house, and they survive today in far smaller numbers, preserved with far less care, studied with far less frequency, visited with far less enthusiasm. The contrast in preservation between the big house and the quarters is not accidental. It reflects a set of choices, made over generations, about which stories a building is considered worth keeping. The people who built these houses, maintained them, cooked in their kitchens, raised children in their nurseries, and polished their floors for decades. They are in the architecture. Their skill is in the plasterwork. Their labor is in the brick. Their lives shaped every room. They were just never meant to be the ones you noticed when you walked through the door. In the winter social season of 1858, a planter named John Hampden Randolph hosted a gathering at Nottoway that his guests would describe for years afterward. The house had been completed only recently, 53,000 square feet, 64 rooms, a white ballroom on the upper floor that Randolph had built specifically for his daughter's coming-out celebrations. The guests arrived by steamboat, pulling up to the river landing as the house revealed itself through the cypress trees, white, vast, and almost aggressively symmetrical against the flat Louisiana sky. They were received in the double parlors. They dined in a room appointed with imported china and silver. They danced in a ballroom whose plaster ceiling had been finished by craftsmen whose names nobody present thought to record. By every account, it was a magnificent evening. Nobody who attended that gathering left a record of what the kitchen looked like before dawn when the preparations had begun. Nobody described the walk back to the quarters in January cold. The evening existed in the documents it left behind entirely as the planter class experienced it, which is to say, as a performance that worked exactly as intended. The Antebellum plantation house was, before almost anything else, a performance space. Every architectural decision discussed in the previous chapter, the central hall, the double parlors, the formal dining room, the soaring ceilings, was also a decision about staging. These rooms were designed to produce specific effects in specific audiences, and the planter who built them understood this as clearly as any theater director understood the relationship between set design and audience response. The double parlor was the primary stage. Two interconnected reception rooms, separated by wide folding doors that could be thrown open to create a single generous space, gave the host flexibility. Intimate conversations in one room, a larger reception in both. The furnishings in these rooms were chosen and arranged with deliberate care, imported Brussels carpets in deep colors, upholstered settees and armchairs in the latest styles from New York or New Orleans, marble-topped side tables, gilt-framed family portraits positioned to catch the light from tall windows. A grand piano if the family could manage it. Decorative objects, vases, clocks, statuettes, arranged on mantelpieces and side tables to signal taste, travel, and access to a wider world of refinement. The message was calibrated to a specific audience of peers. Other planters, their wives, local merchants and lawyers, the occasional visiting politician or northern businessman, these were the people for whom the parlor was arranged. The goal was not merely to impress but to confirm membership, to say through the medium of a well-furnished room, we belong to this class, we share these values, we are the kind of people who live this way. L'appoint. Dining room carried a heavier political charge. Hospitality in the antebellum South was not simply a social nicety. It was a mechanism of power. A planter who fed his neighbors well, who kept a generous table and an open house during the social season, was building and maintaining a web of obligation and alliance that had direct consequences in business, in local politics, in the informal negotiations over land, credit, and labor that governed plantation society. The table itself was a display, multiple courses, each removed and replaced by the silent choreography of domestic workers moving between the dining room and the detached kitchen, soups, fish, roasted meats, vegetables, desserts, wines selected to match each course. The silver on the table was real silver, polished to a mirror finish by the same hands that were not permitted to sit at it. The china was imported, the glassware caught the candlelight. For a guest, seated at that table, the experience was one of effortless abundance. Dishes appeared, glasses were refilled, everything arrived at the correct temperature in the correct sequence without visible effort or coordination. This was the achieved effect of an enormous amount of invisible labor, and the invisibility was not incidental. It was the point. The dining room performance only worked if the backstage remained backstage. The plantation house also functioned as a business headquarters, and this dimension of its use is often underplayed in the romantic retelling. The planter's study or library, positioned toward the rear of the ground floor or sometimes on an upper floor, was where the actual administration of the enterprise took place. Account books were kept here, recording the names, ages, productivity, and appraised values of every enslaved person on the property, alongside crop yields, equipment costs, debt payments, and correspondence with factors. In New Orleans or Charleston, factors were the commission agents who sold the planters cotton or sugar on the market, advanced credit against future crops, and sourced the imported goods that arrived by steamboat, furniture, fabric, wine, machinery. The study was where a planter met with his overseer each morning to receive reports on the previous day's work and issue instructions for the day ahead. It was where he wrote letters to his banker, negotiated the purchase or sale of land, and managed the legal paperwork involved in transactions that, in the antebellum South, routinely included the buying and selling of people. The elegant rooms at the front of the house projected refinement and leisure. The study, a few doors away, was where the machinery of that refinement was managed with ledger and pen. The social season in plantation country ran roughly from late autumn through early spring, the period after the harvest was in and before. The heat and disease risk of the Louisiana or Mississippi summer made extended socializing impractical. During these months, the river road between New Orleans and Baton Rouge was alive with steamboat traffic, carrying guests between plantations. Balls, dinners, and extended house parties moved through the social calendar in a rhythm that the grandest plantation houses were specifically built to support. The white ballroom at Nottoway, plaster white walls, arched windows, a floor of polished wood large enough for a genuine dance, was built for exactly this season. Randolph had daughters to present to society, which meant presenting them to the sons of other planter families, which meant organizing the social occasions at which such presentations could happen naturally. The ballroom was not a luxury in the casual sense. It was infrastructure for a specific social project, the reproduction of planter class identity through the marriage of planter class children. And yet the class that built these houses was, beneath the surface performance, frequently anxious and financially precarious in ways the architecture was specifically designed to conceal. The cotton economy was volatile. Prices moved with global markets that no Louisiana planter could influence or predict. Debt was structural and nearly universal. The credit system that built the houses kept the planters tethered to their factors and their banks in ways that left little actual margin. A bad harvest, a drop in cotton prices, an outbreak of disease among the enslaved workforce, any of these could tip a planter from apparent prosperity into insolvency with startling speed. The credit collapses of the late 1830s had demonstrated this brutally, and the memory of it persisted through the 1840s and into the 1850s boom. The grand house in this context was not just a reward for success. It was also a performance of solvency, a signal to creditors, neighbors, and business partners that the man inside it was good for his debts and worthy of continued extension of credit. To look prosperous was, in the antebellum credit economy, partly how you remained prosperous. The columns were collateral of a different kind. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here. The mythology of the antebellum plantation house, the one that survived into the 20th century through film and tourism and the long cultural project of the lost cause, presents these houses as symbols of leisure, of gracious living, of a world untroubled by hustle or anxiety. The reality is that the people who built and owned them were operating under constant financial pressure in a volatile commodity economy sustained by a system of forced labor that required continuous management and carried the permanent risk of resistance and disruption. The leisure was performed, the grace was staged, the effortlessness was the product of an enormous amount of effort, most of it extracted from people who had no choice in the matter. The guests at Nottoway in the winter of 1858 danced in the white ballroom and dined on imported china and went home with a particular impression of their host and his household. That impression was the whole point. Every room, every surface, every carefully orchestrated sequence of courses had been designed to produce exactly that effect. The house worked. The performance landed. What it cost and who paid for it. That part was never on the program. In the spring of 1865, the steamboats that had carried guests up and down the Mississippi River Road stopped running their social season routes. The cotton factors in New Orleans closed their books on accounts that would never be settled. Across Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia, plantation houses that had hosted balls and business dinners and coming-out celebrations through the previous decade sat suddenly quiet. Their owners bankrupt, displaced, or simply paralyzed by the collapse of the entire economic system that had built and sustained them. The world that produced the antebellum plantation house ended with a completeness that is difficult to overstate. Not just the Confederacy, not just the legal institution of slavery, but the entire interlocking structure of credit, commodity production, forced labor, and social performance that these buildings had been designed to house and project. Gone, inside the span of 4 years, leaving the physical structures behind like shells on a beach after the tide has pulled back. What happened next to those shells is a story about survival, reinvention, and the remarkable human capacity to change the meaning of a place without changing the place itself. The immediate post-war years were brutal for most of these properties. Without the enslaved labor force that had maintained them, plantation houses deteriorated rapidly. The roofs went first, a leak unrepaired becomes a rot becomes a collapse. The galleries sagged, the gardens disappeared under 10 years of unchecked growth. These houses had been kept by dozens of people working every day. Without them, the buildings began dying almost immediately. Some properties changed hands quickly, sold to northern investors or speculators who arrived in the South during Reconstruction with capital and ambition. Others were simply abandoned, left to the slow work of humidity and vegetation. A significant number were lost entirely in these decades. Fire, neglect, demolition for salvage materials. The attrition rate among plantation houses in the late 19th century was substantial. The ones that survived tended to do so for specific reasons. A family that managed to hold on financially, a subsequent owner who found an economic use for the property, or simple geographic luck that kept a house out of the path of development or disaster. What survived, however, did not survive unchanged in meaning. Starting in the 1880s, a story was constructed. Not in secret, in public, in newspapers and monuments and history textbooks. Historians would later call it the lost cause. Its central move was simple: take the Civil War, remove slavery from the explanation, and replace it with something more comfortable: honor, tradition, a civilization unfairly destroyed. The plantation house was the image they built it around. The plantation house was central to this project. In the lost cause telling, these buildings were not command centers of a forced labor system. They were the homes of a refined, cultured aristocracy, people of taste and honor who had built something beautiful and been robbed of it by history. The columns became symbols not of the wealth extracted from enslaved people, but of an idealized Southern character, dignified, rooted, connected to the land. This reinterpretation required considerable selective memory. It required forgetting, or actively suppressing, the account books, the auction records, the architectural logic of the service landscape, the rows of cabins behind the big house. It required centering the experience of one group of people who had lived in these places and rendering another group, the majority in many cases, functionally invisible. It worked for a very long time with remarkable effectiveness. Hollywood accelerated and globalized the mythology. When Gone with the Wind was released in 1939, it delivered the lost cause interpretation of Viao, plantation life to an audience of millions, wrapping it in technicolor grandeur and a celebrated production design that made Tara, a fictional Georgia plantation house, into perhaps the most famous building in American popular culture. The film presented plantation life as a romantic tragedy, its enslaved characters as peripheral figures in someone else's story, the whole antebellum world as something to be mourned rather than examined. The cultural impact was enormous and lasting. Tourism to surviving plantation houses increased. The houses were marketed in the language the film had made familiar: gracious, historic, beautiful, a window into a vanished world. Photographs emphasized columns and allées. Brochures described formal gardens and period furnishings. The quarters, where they survived at all, were mentioned briefly or not at all. The economic reinvention of these properties followed a predictable arc. Some became private, homes for wealthy families who could afford the maintenance. Some were subdivided into apartments or allowed to decay into rooming houses. A significant number found their most durable post-war business model in the mid-20th century when the heritage tourism economy began to take shape across the South. Houses like Oak Alley and Nottoway opened to paying visitors, offering tours of the formal rooms, the gardens, the architectural features. Some added restaurants, gift shops, overnight accommodations. Oak Alley today operates as a full resort with cottages for overnight guests and a restaurant in a restored outbuilding. Nottoway operates as a hotel and event venue. The plantation house had found its 21st century economic purpose. As a setting for weddings, anniversary dinners, and weekend escapes, the imagery of antebellum grandeur repackaged as luxury hospitality. But the story being told inside these houses was beginning slowly and unevenly to change. By the late 20th century, a generation of historians, preservationists, and descendants of enslaved people had begun pushing back against the interpretive framework that had governed plantation tourism since its inception. The argument was straightforward: a site that tells only the story of the planter family is not preserving history. It is curating a myth. Some sites responded, interpretive programs were revised, guides were trained to discuss enslaved life alongside architectural history. Archaeological work on quarter sites began to recover material evidence of lives that the documentary record had largely ignored. Others resisted, calculating, correctly in some cases, that their paying visitors preferred the romance to the reckoning. The houses stood through all of it, through bankruptcy and abandonment, through the lost cause reinvention, through Hollywood and heritage tourism, and the slow, contested process of reinterpretation. They outlasted the system that built them, outlasted the mythology that rescued them from decay, and arrived in the present moment still standing, still beautiful, and still carrying, in their floor plans and their service entrances and their carefully positioned back stairs, the full record of what they were actually built to do. The columns did not change. The stories told beneath them did. That tension is what the final chapter has to reckon with. On a Tuesday morning in December 2014, a museum opened in Wallace, Louisiana, on the west bank of the Mississippi River, about 30 miles upstream from New Orleans. The property had been a working sugar plantation. The big house still stood, a modest but genuine antebellum structure, white-painted with the deep galleries characteristic of Louisiana plantation architecture. There were outbuildings. There was land. There was, in other words, everything a plantation heritage site needed to open its doors and begin receiving visitors in the manner that dozens of similar properties across the South had been doing for decades. Whitney Plantation did not do that. Instead, its founder, a Louisiana lawyer who had spent 15 years and a reported $8 million of his own money on the project, opened a museum organized entirely around the experience of the people who had been enslaved there. The big house was present but not centered. What visitors encountered first were the memorials, a wall of iron placards bearing the names of the over 300 enslaved people documented at Whitney. Statues of enslaved children cast in iron standing in the formal garden, a reconstructed slave cabin furnished as it would have been. The Field of Angels, a memorial to enslaved. Children who died at Whitney and on surrounding plantations, their names inscribed in a gable rescued from a dismantled church. The tour began not in the parlor, but at the memorial wall. Whitney Plantation was not the first site to take the experience of enslaved people seriously, but it was the most uncompromising, and its opening landed in American cultural conversation like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples still moving outward a decade later. The debate Whitney forced into the open had been building for years. It was, at its core, a question about what a historic site is for. What is a plantation site actually for? Save the building. That's one answer. Tell the full story. That's another. Keep the visitors happy and the revenue coming. That's a third. Most sites have been running all three answers simultaneously, hoping no one notices when they, contradict each other. Most plantation tourism sites have historically answered this question by prioritizing the first and third considerations over the second. The architecture is described. The furnishings are dated and attributed. The family history is narrated. The commercial transaction, the ticket, the tour, the gift shop, the restaurant is completed. The history of the enslaved community, if addressed at all, has typically been compressed into a single stop on the tour, a single panel in the exhibition, a brief acknowledgement before returning to the parlor furniture. The argument made by Whitney and by a growing body of historians and descendants organizations is that this approach does not merely omit history. It actively perpetuates a distortion, the same distortion the Lost Cause Project constructed in the 1880s, now maintained not by Confederate monuments but by the architecture of a heritage tour. The response from other plantation sites has been uneven, and it is worth being honest about that unevenness. Some properties have undertaken genuine interpretive revision. Laura Plantation on the River Road, which tells the story of 4 generations of a Creole family including its enslaved members through an unusually rich documentary record, has long offered a more complex narrative than the standard tour. Monticello in Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's plantation, technically outside the Deep South but central to the national conversation, has undergone a significant transformation in how it presents enslaved life, adding reconstructed spaces, named individuals, and interpretive programs that place slavery at the center rather than the margin of the site's story. Others have made smaller adjustments, adding a quarter tour, revising brochure language, training guides to field questions about slavery with more substance than before, while leaving the fundamental orientation of the visitor experience unchanged. The big house remains the destination. The architecture of refinement remains the primary subject. The aesthetic experience the visitor came for is still delivered, and some sites have made a different calculation entirely, that their market, the wedding parties, the anniversary dinners, the weekend guests booking cottages, does not want the reckoning, and that providing it would damage a business model that the property's survival depends on. This is where the conversation stands in the present moment, and it is genuinely unresolved. There is a version of the preservation argument that deserves to be taken seriously. These buildings are irreplaceable physical artifacts. The craftsmanship embedded in their plasterwork, their millwork, their brick and timber construction represents skills and techniques that no longer exist in the same form, allowing them to deteriorate through neglect, through the economics of deferred maintenance, through demolition, would be a permanent loss. Preservation requires money. Money, in the current economy, often comes from tourism. Tourism requires a product that people will pay for. The counter-argument is equally serious. A preservation strategy that maintains the building while suppressing the full history of the people who built and inhabited it is not neutral. It makes a choice about whose story is worth preserving. And that choice, made thousands of times across hundreds of sites over more than a century, has produced a landscape of public memory in which the architecture of the planter class is meticulously maintained while the material evidence of enslaved life, the quarters, the work yards, the kitchen outbuildings, has been allowed to disappear at a rate no one found alarming enough to reverse. The Ashadans, houses themselves, are indifferent to this argument. They stand where they were built, doing what architecture always does, outlasting the intentions of the people who made them and accumulating meanings those people never anticipated. Walk through the front door of Oak Alley today, and the air still moves through the central hall with the same cross-draft efficiency it had in 1839. The ceilings are still 12 to 15 feet high. The galleries still wrap around all four sides, still shading the walls from the afternoon sun. The alley of 28 live oaks, planted in the 18th century, long before the house was built, by hands whose names the documentary record did not think worth keeping, is still there, still drawing the eye toward the house from the river road. The beauty has not diminished. The questions the beauty raises have only grown larger. What do you do with a place like this? The beauty is real. The cost was real. Every generation that has stood in front of these columns has had to decide what to do with holding both of those things at once. That decision, right now, is being made again. That choice, right now, is being made again. And unlike the people who built these houses, we can see exactly what we are deciding. And why it matters.